It's time for forgiveness and welcome, everybody. This is our first show in 2025, the new year, and we're really enthused and we're really excited. Looking forward to kicking this off with John Burke. We had John on last year, and John, again, is the best-selling author, speaker, pastor. His books are Imagine Heaven and Imagine the God of Heaven, best-selling books he's got out. And John, so great to be in conversation with you again this morning.
Great to see you, Bob and Kelly. Great to be back.
Yeah, we are looking forward to diving in. We've got some interesting conversation. And even after the last time, we had so many comments just about what we were talking about and people wanting to know more.
Right. I think, and where we're going to start, everyone, is we're going to get into thoughts. John kind of teed this up before he came on air, and how thoughts can permeate our actions. And it just rang a bell, I think, for Kelly and I, John, because in our story, The Ravine, a real life story that our family experienced, Danny, and all of this came through to us from the character in the story, who actually was a real life person, Joanna. But Joanna told us how the darkness, if you will, evil, permeated into Danny's thought process over time. And she used a lot of different words to explain how that metaphorically, I think, so we got a vision of that, how that can seep into the crevices of our mind, if you will, over time, and infect us and then actually start to move us in the wrong direction. Thoughts are things, right? And so I think we'd love to pick it up there. And the only reason I say that, John, is because the Danny that we knew for many, many years, in our mind, could have never committed that heinous act that he did. But I think, Kelly, and you can maybe share your thoughts before John goes into this, but I think that in a way that it didn't, in my mind, it didn't like rationalize for me how this whole thing happened, but it did help in a sense that everything that we've learned in our faith, that darkness is a real thing and we have to guard the door to our mind from it. What were your thoughts, honey?
Well, because I want to keep going to what you were just saying, and that's something I want to talk about because that was brought to our attention. And I think, it wasn't trying to understand who did it. We knew who did it. It was trying to understand how he got there. Mm-hmm. And I know that we've had responses about, oh, okay, well, that evil voice made him do it, so now he's not responsible. I'm not saying he's not responsible. I just tried to understand, like Bob had said, how could someone get that far off track? And so I would love your thoughts into that.
Yeah, well, let me back up just a little bit by saying, what has really changed my mind is hearing. As you guys know, I've studied over 1,000 near-death experiences, probably close to 1,500 now. That opened me up to when I was still an agnostic engineer, to actually reading the Bible, and because so many of them were encountering the God that seemed to be what I'd heard about in my childhood that I'd rejected. So I came to faith, and over the years, I went from a career in engineering to becoming a pastor.
Can I ask you though, why did you reject? Why did you reject? I'm just curious. You said, as a non-believer, what was it that you were rejecting? I want to know that before you keep going.
I was an engineer, so my mind works a certain way, and it's very inquisitive. It's like, well, how do you know? Well, why? Well, how does that make sense? And I was always asking those questions, like, okay, Jesus is the Son of God. How do you know? I mean, legends form of people, like, why don't you think that just formed as a legend? Maybe he was a good teacher, but God, how do you know there's a God? I mean, there's not evidence. You can find evidence that there's not. That was the way my mind worked.
Okay.
So, and I don't remember if we covered this in our first podcast, but when my dad was dying of cancer, someone gave him the very first research on near-death experiences. So when people clinically die and yet they're resuscitated and they come back describing being more alive than they ever felt in this life, in a place more real than this has ever felt. And like I said, in the presence of this God of light and love, many of them talked about meeting Jesus on the other side. So that opened my mind. And then I dove into the Bible. And then I started seeing for other actual historical reasons why I believed that God had really revealed himself in actual history and through Jesus. So I came to faith, and then I continued to work as an engineer and share these things, and bit by bit I felt like this is what I'm supposed to do. Like, why don't people know this stuff? So it was evidence for me that held me back. But once I had the evidence was overwhelming. But then there's also the heart, right? And the heart came slower, of actually saying, okay, I'm going to let you be God instead of me being God. I mean, I would never say that, but that's the reality, right? My will be done is I get to play God. And so I came to a point of surrender.
Right, and those things don't happen overnight. So I appreciate you saying that. It was a process, and especially
It's a process.
with
It
the
was
analytical mind that you had to be able to connect the dots, and so that took time. It's not like
and I'm just giving a little backstory to say that evidence initially is what held me back from faith. But then once the evidence was there, you still, faith is like a relationship, right? So you can know all this information about the person, but that doesn't mean you're willing to say, I do, and trust yourself to that person, right? And trust that person. And relationship with God is like that. And so there was also the decision of the heart, and that came later. But I did end up going from a career in engineering into ministry. Years later, my wife and I started a church for skeptics like me in Austin. And I say all that because, I have, I've spent 30 years pastoring people. And one of the things that I've realized more than anything is the way evil works in the world is through lies and deception. That lies and deception are the power of evil in the world, which means it all starts in our thoughts. And if you think about it, like, because I've counseled, my wife and I've counseled anorexic women, for instance, this one woman I'm thinking of, and she was literally killing herself believing that she was obese and overweight, and yet she was 85 pounds. And I asked her to write down the thoughts that she was having. And they were thoughts like, I look horrible. God is disgusted with me because I'm so fat. I mean, there are all these things that were just absolutely not true.
right, this lies she was telling herself.
But
Why she was telling.
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, if we tell ourselves a lie, even if it's a lie, if we tell ourselves something over and over again, at some point, the subconscious mind is going to accept it as real, and we're going to act on it, good, bad, or indifferent. And I think that's what you're talking about. It's a repetition of an idea. We teach this, John, but it's the repetition. This is the way we interpret it, is that if you form an idea in your mind and you emotionalize it long enough, it's going in the subconscious, the heart, and then we're going to act on it, and it's also going to act on us. But go ahead. What did you want to say?
Well, to further that, you can intellectually say these wonderful things about you, but at a deep subconscious level where your soul is, like, you believe something very different. And then you act that out in your behavior. But I'm curious, why do you think as a society, like, it's so easy to accept these lies?
Well, I mean, so that's kind of where I'm going, is that there are deep, dark lies that then, like you're saying, I mean, and we are spirit, soul, and body, right? So as you know, even the neural networks of our minds can imprint. You have a negative, horrible thought over and over and over again, and it imprints in a way that um, it's there in your mind. You have to root it out, right? And so, but we also have a will. Our soul has a will, and we have a spirit, and our spirit can be connected to God and hear the thoughts from God, but we can also hear these thoughts. And this is part of the thing I want people to understand, is not every thought you think is your thought. And I think that's a really critical thing.
Okay, so John, let's emphasize that. Not You just said not every thought you think is not your thought. So where do these thoughts, ideas come from?
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that there's a passage in Scripture, in the Bible, in Corinthians, that says, take every thought captive. Take every thought captive and submit it to God. And that is because thoughts can come into our minds, and the way evil works in the world is through placing thoughts in there that we can reject or we can accept, and then we can start to nurture great, horrible evil, like what you guys experienced, or even what this woman who was driven into anorexia, where she was killing herself, right? Or you can see it in societies, right? And I mean, we look back at the Holocaust and we go, how could they possibly, right? And yet thoughts in society then start, and people start to take those thoughts in and go, yeah, okay, this particular group of people deserve to be, have this done, or fear keeps them from doing anything about it. So great mass evil can be done, but it still starts with lies and thoughts. But here's the more sinister part of it, is we all deal with it. It's not just like murderers, or people who are destroying themselves suicidally, or anorexia, or those kinds of things. It's me. It's me with simple little thoughts. So I'll give you, and thoughts affect us. I'll give you an example. So one of the people who had a near-death experience that I interviewed, her name was Penny. She's a nurse, and she had, her husband left her and abandoned their kids when her kids were really little. As a result, she had a lot of resentment because, she saw her kids go through feeling like there was something wrong with them, that their dad would keep promising to come to games and never come, or promise to come to a birthday and not show up, or just wasn't a faithful guy, right? And it caused resentments in her. She actually, she ends up having, it was a reaction to penicillin, I believe, or maybe it was a peanut allergy. But anyway, she goes into anaphylactic shock, and her heart stops. She's in the hospital when it happens. Her heart stops, and she has a near-death experience. And I won't go into the whole of it, but in this near-death experience, she comes into the presence of who she knows is God. There is no doubt. He says, "I am," and she was like, there was no doubt, and the love and the acceptance she felt from God was just overwhelming. But there were also some interesting things that he did. He said, he showed her. So one of the commonalities of a near-death experience is in the presence of God. Many times people get a life review. So time works differently. On the other side, it's exactly like Jesus' disciple Peter said in 2 Peter 3:8. He said to the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. And near-death experiencers say, time didn't work the same way. I don't know if it was minutes or days, but I relived my life. And so it's like God shows them and lets them relive each moment of life, not only remembering the things they were feeling and thinking and all that, but also experiencing how it affected the other people they interacted with. And the whole thing is emphasizing relationship, how we treat one another. Now, here's what's interesting is Penny said, she was fearing that because she said, I'd done some pretty bad things in my life that I was pretty ashamed of. And I wasn't real excited about, reliving them there with God. And she said, but she actually felt this overwhelming support and love from God, forgiveness from him. And she had given her life to Christ years earlier, but had struggled as well. But she said, but of all the things that I thought, he was going to show me, like, look at what you did here, look what you did here. She said the thing he actually pointed out was actually the hardest thing for me to continue to deal with. And she said, he showed me my thoughts.
Wow.
And what he showed her was this scene with a woman that she was a fellow nurse. And this fellow nurse, she said, she was snarky. She was just not easy to get along with. She would always, let her patients' buzzers go off and not change their bedpan until I would finally go in and change the bedpan for them. And Penny said, I never really said anything to her, but I had thoughts toward her.
Sure.
And so the thoughts were, what a lame, blah, blah, blah. And what,
Yeah.
I mean, we all have those kinds of judgmental thoughts
All
toward
day
another
long.
person.
They say the average human has 60 to 80,000 thoughts a day.
Yeah.
I think that the challenge is most of us have the same 80,000 thoughts yesterday and the day before and the day before. So it's just it's a repetition. It's behavior that's unconscious,
But
we just run it like a record over and over again. Go
But
ahead.
I think here we're thinking in our minds, I didn't speak it. It was just a whisper, so it doesn't really matter. So I
Right.
love
And
that
it
you're
does matter.
talking about this because it does.
So, John, let me ask you about this free will, okay? Because I think this is free will to me. It's an interesting concept. To me, in what I've studied, is free will is the ability to actually form any idea in our conscious mind. And then from there, if we, through repetition, if we hold on to that idea over and over and over, and we get emotionally involved with it, then we're going to act on it. So that is actually the free will part, is the idea that we can think any thought. Do you agree with that, or how do you teach free will?
Yeah, well, I do. I think, and remind me to come back to what the Lord said to Penny about those thoughts, because I think that's really important. But I think God is love, and near-death experiencers all around the world confirm that. But that's also what God said to Moses in 3500 BC, to love the Lord your God. That was the creed of Israel. That was the most important command. And then love your neighbor as yourself. It says in Leviticus, Jesus comes along and says, the greatest command is love God. And the second, you can't separate from the first, love your neighbor as yourself. Do these two and you fulfill all the commands of Scripture. In other words, it's all about love. And the important thing about that is love can't be forced. Love can't be bought. Love can't be coerced. It has to be free. If I fall in love with someone, I could buy them gifts, but how do I know they don't love the gifts rather than actually love me? Mm-hmm. I could try to manipulate them or even force them to love me, but we would all know that that's not love. And so even with God, I think he gives us free will as a necessary part of what it means to be able to love God and to love one another. And I think that is the central purpose of humanity.
Okay.
Everything else is about that.
Let's go back to Penny. Is this a good time to go back to what God told Penny
Yeah.
about her thoughts?
What the Lord showed Penny is that she was having these negative thoughts toward this other nurse. And this doesn't normally happen in a life review, but he actually let Penny see this nurse's growing up. And she saw how this nurse had been horrifically abused by her father over and over and over again. And how she had actually gone into nursing to make something good, to help people rather than harm people like she had been harmed. And what the Lord was saying, and what Penny got was, oh my gosh, like I was judging her as such a horrible person, but the truth is she's killing it. Like from where she came and the growth and the distance she's come is amazing. And why didn't I, as a follower of Jesus, take time to get to know her, to ask questions, to care about her? Instead, I was just judging her constantly in my mind. And what the Lord said is, Penny, what you have to realize is thoughts have a certain energy or power to them. Words have even more. So if you think about that, you can just think something. You can think you are a blah, 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 right? That's going to hurt you, but you say it to the person, that's going to hurt them. So there's more power in a word. By the way, I think that's why Jesus' half-brother James says, the tongue is like a tiny rudder that steers a big ship. Like, your tongue, what you say can direct this big ship of your life. And so thoughts have one power, words have another, and Jesus said, but actions have even more power. But it all starts with the thoughts. So
Thoughts,
if you think
feelings,
about that,
actions, right?
thoughts lead to our words, lead to our actions.
But they all have energy to them. And
They
I
do.
think we don't understand that energy is felt and it's shared. I
Yes.
want to ask you a quick question. Do you believe then that one of our superpowers, why we're here, is the ability to choose, the ability to accept any idea and to reject any idea? Because I believe a lot of us are accepting the wrong ideas and we're rejecting the right ideas. But do you believe that's one of our superpowers?
Yeah, I believe that's part of what it means that we were created in the image of God. It says that in Genesis, that male and female were created in the image of God. Well, what does that mean? Well, if God is love and God is creative, and God has the ability to make things out of nothing, right? And he has given us that wild ability. I mean, you don't see herds of dogs building big skyscrapers or, AI models. I mean, we have uniquely been given this creative ability to imagine things that aren't and bring them into being, to be creators ourselves. And so yes, so that is where our thoughts are powerful for good, and they can be powerful for evil. And that's why it's so important that we pay attention to our thoughts. And by the way, I think it's also why we need to understand the thoughts and character of God. I think that's why we need to study the teachings of Jesus and what is the, because our thoughts can be deceived. We can think we're thinking right and doing right when in fact we're not. And history's replete with examples of that. But let me, one other near-death experience I studied, a guy named Kevin. He was on a dental surgery on the operating table, and some reaction happened with the anesthesia, and he dies. He codes on the operating table, and he's up above and he's watching this, and Jesus is there with him, he said. And Jesus begins to go through his life. And one of the things that he showed him, and just like all the others, feeling just like never wants to leave his presence, right? Because he realizes, I am his child. I was created by this being who loves me more than any ever could. But at the same time, he said, Kevin, I want to show you something. And it's like he shows him his spirit and his soul. And in his spirit, there was light. And he said, that is my light in you, Kevin. It is there, the image of me. But look closely at your soul. And I don't know the framework of how he showed them this, but Kevin said, what I saw were these dark spots. And Jesus said, look closer. And he said, what they were words that had been spoken over me as a kid. And these words, and Jesus said, you've been thinking and saying the wrong things, and it's detouring your life from the purpose I created you for. And what he saw, these blemishes on his soul that Jesus was saying need to be healed, were words like his father saying, you'll never amount to anything. You're so worthless. Can't you ever get it right? I mean, all these condemning thoughts
that he accepted over time.
Accepted and thought were true. He believed them. And man, I have seen this, you guys, pastoring people for 30 years, that it's subconscious to us at a certain level, right? No, it is true.
Well, that's the thing about the subconscious mind, is that it is amoral and it doesn't differentiate between what's real and what's imagined. So even if it's based in total nonsense, if we emotionalize that idea, his father saying this to him over and over and over again, John, at some point, he's going to accept that as fact.
Right.
And then I don't know the story of the dad, but more than likely, that's what was said to him. It's just,
exactly.
It goes from generation to generation until, like you said, you root it out.
But I think this is really important, and we're so glad we talked about this today, because this is how we attract everything into our life. It's through thoughts and it's through words. And if we don't like what we have to go back. And I think what you're saying, John, is, take some time and examine this, right? Look at the thoughts that you're entertaining, the words you're speaking, not just audibly, but internally. And does that match up with what you really want? And then look at the life you're leading too, because that's probably going to be a representation of the manifestation of what you are speaking and thinking.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I'll give you the probably the most convicting for all of us is I have watched how couples who are struggling, married couples struggling, there might have been a breach, there might have been a hurt, there might have been a wound, or many of them, right? But what ends up taking them to the divorce courts is thoughts that they keep playing over and over and over again. And then seeing actions that see, and I am absolutely convinced, the word devil actually means to throw apart.
Throw apart.
Diabolos is the Greek, right? Dia, apart, balos, to throw. Throw apart, diabolos, devil. So when you read that, it's literally what evil is doing, is trying to divide and destroy, to throw apart. Wow. And that's why I said the thoughts. So sometimes, I'll just give you a real world, it's made up, but it happens all the time. So there's something that bothers one spouse about the other, and they do it, and a thought comes in, look at that, they did it again. Are you going to put up with this? Why should I put up? Now, here's the tricky part. These thoughts are in the first person. Why should I put up with this? I don't deserve this. Okay, I would say that not all those thoughts are yours, and you need to recognize them and reject them unless you just want to keep going down that road. But once you do accept them, then they do become yours.
Yeah, I know you want to comment on that.
I mean, I wanted to say a couple things. Just, you're kind of like, this is just a made up scenario, but it's really not made up. It's what every
It happens to all
couple
of us.
experiences all day long. And so
And
just to bring awareness to that, to really cause you to pause and to think and really choose, because I've had those thoughts. And I mean,
Yeah.
I'm going to be honest
too.
here.
Nobody's
And
perfect, sure.
but you then also go to a place of like shame with yourself. Like, I can't believe I thought that. But maybe it wasn't even coming from me, but it was something that I was maybe asked to be entertaining. Because I want to go back to what you said when you talked about the devil and you were saying with one another, but that's also what is the work is to separate us from God. And it's
separate us from God and separate us from each other. And that's why Jesus' last prayer was for our unity, that we would be one just as he and the Father are one. So bringing back together in harmony the way God intended us all to be, united in love, that's what God was doing through Jesus, but it's what he's continuing to do. And I think that's where God's Spirit is also whispering to us in our thoughts. One of the most powerful things I realized, and it's a long story of how I realized it, but is that I always thought, why didn't God speak to me? If God wants a relationship and God wants to lead me, why didn't he speak to me? I never hear anything. And I never have. And then what I realized by practicing this thing I'm going to tell you about is that audible communication is actually less direct than the way God actually does speak to us. So right now, I'm trying to get all these thoughts in my head into you guys' heads and your listeners' heads. We have to use microphones. We have to use English language. I have to use my mouth. And by the way, I can only speak about 125 words a minute, but you're thinking 400 words a minute. So you're actually adding lots of thoughts and words to my ideas. And you may be hearing, and some of it may be going into your mind, but you may be thinking about lunch or breakfast or something,
Mm-hmm.
So audible communication is very difficult. What would be more direct is if I could just put all my thoughts right now in your mind. Then you would at least know my thoughts, right? Now, you could still reject those thoughts. You could say, well, that's stupid. I'm not even going to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be more direct. Now, I can't do that, but that is, I think, what God can do.
Mm-hmm.
So God speaks to us. Jesus often said, whoever has ears to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says. Well,
then he speaks.
we all have these. So he's talking about a spiritual hearing.
But are you saying then he places those thoughts and it's through our imagination that we accept them and move those into form?
Well, I think, well, when we say imagination, sometimes people think imagination means imaginary, and it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't necessarily. So yes, in our thoughts. Okay, I'll give you an example. This is how I actually learned this. So I'm pretty new to faith. I'm praying one day, and I'm praying about something completely different when the thought, call Allison, comes into my mind. Allison's my younger sister. And I just thought that I'm not going to do that. I don't know why I thought that. And I keep praying about this other thing, and the thought, call Allison, comes into my mind again. And again, I'm like, I'm not going to call Allison. She's not even home. She's at school. And a third time, this pretty intense feeling like, call Allison. And so the third time, because I was praying, I think, I was like, God, am I supposed to call Allison? Nothing. I don't get a yes. I don't get a no. I don't know. You know, it's pretty confusing. But I decided to call my sister just in faith, just in case. And when I called her, I find out she was not at school because she was depressed. These things had been happening to her. It had, it was pretty severe. And I realized, oh my gosh, like God just spoke to me. He wanted me to care about my sister and help her in her time of need. And that came directly into my thoughts. So you might call them promptings.
I would call it intuition that God
It can be
grants
intuition.
us higher faculties, imagination, the will, perception, intuition. And I think the thing is that we have to build the intuition. That's what I think you're talking about here, John, is to understand that we do need to act on those types of thoughts because they are coming maybe from a higher power. And those are things that we do. Because oftentimes you can be thinking of someone else and then all of a sudden you get a phone call and it's that person. Or you call that person like you mentioned in this scenario and they say, oh, I was just thinking about you. And so I think those things are real, and those are the things that can guide us but as Kelly's saying, the ability to understand where are those thoughts coming from? Are they coming from God or are they coming from the other side, right?
Right.
And the ability to accept and then also reject, I think that's the greatest skill that we need to learn, is the ability to accept and reject thoughts and reject the thoughts that aren't going to serve us. But I think this is probably a good spot to segue. We're going to take a break. Go ahead.
Before we do that, I just want to acknowledge you and say thank you so much for your work, because after I was reading your books, I think I had such a fear in regards to the idea of that life review, and I was making it so difficult for myself. You're just like, should I do that? What if I didn't do that? Did I do enough? And when you broke it down to the two questions, how did you use your life? And did you show love the way you should have? It simplified it. And I was like, I can do that. I can do that. And this is not a grand example, but last night I was out and it was cold and it was late and I didn't have the right coat on and I was tired and I wanted to just get home. And I left the place I was shopping and had the cart, and I just thought, well, I'm just going to shove it up over here. And then I thought for a second, well, you ought to put that away. But I justified it because I'm like, well, there's others thrown over there, so I'll just put mine with that. But I really thought about those questions, and it caused me to go, well, who's going to have to come out and get my cart? And I thought, I don't want them to do that, and I put it back. So I know that but I know that sounds like such a little thing, but it has caused me it simplified it, and it just brought enthusiasm of like, I can do this. Instead of out of fear, if that makes sense to you.
Absolutely. And what you realize, and that's what I was trying to write and show, especially in Imagine the God of Heaven, that God is so kind and so patient and forgiving and loving. He doesn't sit there and, condemn and shame, but, you keep doing it. And why did you do that again? And why? No, it's just like, look, it's like a little kid, my little granddaughter learning to walk. She falls a lot, right? She's been to the hospital twice for falling and hitting her head on something. And, but we keep picking her up and saying, okay, let's try again. Let's be more careful next time. Right. And eventually she walks and will run and play soccer. And we are the same as spiritual children of God. That's what we are all intended to be, his children. And he treats us like that. And so, and the amazing thing, what we see, I think, through the life review is that one, he does forgive all of our wrongs, as long as we don't hold on to them as, no, I'm right, and I don't need your forgiveness.
That's
as long as we don't do that.
I think that's a great place. We're going to pick up on that on our next episode, John. I think that's a great place to start. So let's get into that conversation on more into forgiveness. But John, you're amazing. We're gonna take a short break. Look for episode 2. That's going to be the next conversation here we're going to have with John Burke, again, the best-selling author of Imagine God and Imagine the God of Heaven. And John, thank you. We'll be back in a few minutes. Don't forget to like and share if you're benefiting from these conversations. I don't know how you're not. Kelly and I are just loving this. We were so enthused to get back on this conversation with you, John. So thank you for your insight and wisdom and just your heart to share with our audience today. And we'll be right back with you on Time for Forgiveness.